As we nervously await the end of the world, we're going to give the evolutionary tree of life a good shake, talk about fish legs, and the second annual Stop Ian Juby Symposium. Stick around, this is Genesis Week. And a welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy, made possible by the supporters of CORE Ottawa, Citizens for Origins Research and Education, and now carried on the Christianima Network, christianima.com, Christian cinema at its finest. Excellence in Pirate Broadcasting, we took over Gunkanjima for this week's broadcast so we can continue to bring you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear, and giving glory to our creator while doing it. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, you can just punch in wazulu.com or genesisweek.com and you will find us. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel to get extras like Crevo rants and full interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. A couple of stories today involve giving the evolutionary tree of life a good, solid shake to see what kind of fruit falls out of the tree. Now, you've probably all seen Darwin's proposed tree of life, where organisms all branch off from a common ancestor. Now, while this tree of life is portrayed so often in our textbooks, the fact of the matter is, there is no tree of life that the evolutionary community agrees upon. In fact, almost daily, there are challenges to that tree of life. One of those challenges came out this past week regarding some of the alleged oldest fossil beds in the world, the Ediacaran of Australia. The Ediacaran are a fairly famous fossil, and we have a similar bed here in Newfoundland at Mistaken Point. The fossils are considered some of the earliest life, which was supposed to have arisen in the oceans. Gregory Retallick published his studies of the rocks and fossils in Nature magazine, claiming the rocks were once soils and the fossils were lichens. In other words, the fossils are of landlubbers, not sea dwellers. University of Oregon Communications quoted Retallick as saying, "This discovery has implications for the tree of life because it removes the Ediacaran fossils from the ancestry of animals." Guy Narbonne put it in no uncertain terms to Science News. If Ediacarans did turn out to be terrestrial, the implications would go far beyond rethinking where Earth's earliest complex multicellular organisms lived, says longtime Ediacaran researcher Guy Narbonne of Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. He doesn't agree with the new results, but if they were correct, it could mean that decades of studies of ancient environments were based on flawed assumptions. Indeed, we're talking about shaking the very trunk of the evolutionary tree of life. Did this critter live in the ocean or on land? Retallick even went so far as to suggest that instead of the sea life eventually moving on to land, perhaps it was the other way around. Life evolved on land and then moved to the sea. Such a radical departure from expectations puts a major branch in the tree of life where it was least expected, right at the base of the tree. But let's give the tree another good, hard shake. It was recently discovered that not only do bats and whales share similar design in their sonar systems, but apparently they also share the same genes for the sonar system. We discussed alleged convergent evolution in Crevo Rant number 172, divergent, convergent, parallel, pre-adaptive, reductive evolution. If two organisms are alleged to have branched off from a common ancestor, and the common ancestor as well as the two organisms all have that same trait, this is called divergent evolution. The organisms diverged from a common ancestor. In fact, we should see a lot of this divergent evolution, were evolution true. However, when two organisms that have little to no relationship with each other develop the same trait that their nearest common ancestor did not have, evolution is still assumed. In fact, it's given a fancy new name and proclaimed to be convergent evolution. Allegedly separate organisms converged on the same solution, developing the same systems independently. Now, while evolutionary theory must twist and contort to fit this evidence, it all fits in quite nicely within the model of a common designer. Rather than re-engineer complex sonar systems, the designer of the bats and whales simply incorporated his prefabricated designs into multiple organisms. However, evolutionary theory must now jump all kinds of hoops, calling upon convergent evolution to produce not one, but two miracles: the development of sonar systems that are identical in many ways in completely different animals, each of which develops the systems completely on their own. It takes less faith to believe in a common designer than it does to believe in the evolutionary processes. We've all heard the dramatic story about how our ancient fish ancestor grew legs and walked up onto land, becoming the first land animal. In an attempt to trace these evolutionary changes, Italian scientists monkeyed with the DNA of a zebrafish, inserting Hox genes from a mouse into the fish. Now, if you're a regular viewer of this show, you'll recall that Hox genes are genes that control your other genes, and they are charged with the task of assembling you in the right order. In other words, the Hox genes tell the genes that build your arms, say, you build arms here. You, the one with the genes for the legs, you build those here. So Freitas et al. Took the HOXD13 gene from a mouse and inserted it into a zebrafish embryo. Lo and behold, the zebrafish grew badly mutated fins. Freitas et al. Felt that these fins vaguely resembled a leg more than a fin, and concluded that the common ancestor of the mouse and the zebrafish must have had the HOXD13 gene, because the zebrafish was influenced by the Hox gene. Now, first of all, these legs could hardly be called as such. In fact, notice that the authors acknowledge that genetic diseases are associated with the misshaping of our organs during development. In the case of genes involved in limb formation, their abnormal function is associated with diseases such as syn polydactyly and hand-foot genital syndrome. The point being, once again, mutations lead to disease and malformity, not benefit and upwards-onwards evolution. Now, reading the Nature paper, it's real easy to miss a key point in the paper. But luckily for us, it's mentioned clear as day in the Spanish newspaper, El Mundo. Now, I don't read Spanish, but that's okay. I have a Spanish to English dictionary, and as near as I can figure, the article reads, they've only been able to take the development of the modified organisms until the 4th day of life, owing to, because of the fact that come to this point, the larvae, they need to feed themselves, and for this purpose, they need to swim, something that they cannot do with these members artificially modified. Translation of the translation: the mutated embryos died after 4 days because they can't swim and they can't feed themselves. Yeah, that's some evolution, ain't it? Look, just because the genes of an organism are influenced by the genes of another organism, which was manually inserted by the specific intent and design of still yet another organism, does not mean all 3 organisms evolved from the same common ancestor. All 3 organisms having the same common designer can also achieve the same results. We've seen where similar or identical Hox genes were used in multiple organisms. In fact, some of those common Hox genes are found in organisms whose alleged common ancestor did not have the same Hox gene. Now, while the evolution myth has to shuffle things around and call this convergent evolution, the evidence fits in beautifully within the interpretation of a common designer. The designer uses the same genes, organs, etc. in multiple organisms where he can, instead of re-engineering the parts all over again for each specific organism. It's efficient use of materials and time. In a series of astonishing statements, Dr. Stephen Benner criticized the designer of DNA A designer he doesn't appear to believe even exists, ironically. In a Nature News interview, Benner derided DNA and its designer, saying that the first thing you realize is that DNA is a stupid design. Really? Let me get this straight. A guy who has not yet begun to fathom the complexities and intricacies of DNA and how it's used to make life has the gall, the audacity to call it a stupid design? I do not mean this as an insult, but I must be blunt. Until Dr. Benner can produce a living cell from scratch, he is in absolutely no position to criticize the design of life and DNA. Such criticisms would be arrogant and ignorant. It's like criticizing the engineers who designed the space shuttle for their horrible design when you yourself have never built a space shuttle and do not even understand how the space shuttle works. Now, if you watched Crevo Rant number 67, Poor Design, I share some of my own story of my own glorious arrogance and ignorance in attempting to design and build a submarine robot. I built 5 different submarines. Why 5? Because the first 4 sunk. In each rendition, I discovered why engineers designed their commercial submarines the way they did. Little by little, my submarines took on the same design other engineers had. Why? Because I learned the hard way why they designed their submarines the way they did. My submarines quickly took the shape of other commercial submarines that I had so arrogantly and ignorantly criticized. When you dig through the interview with Benner, you start to see that he's been going through the same process. Life may have had good reasons for settling on this structure, but that hasn't stopped Benner and others from trying to change it. Over the past few decades, they've tinkered with DNA's basic building blocks and developed a menagerie of exotic letters beyond A, T, C, and G that can partner up and be copied in similar ways. But the work has presented one, expletive deleted, problem after another, says Benner. Really? You mean the stupid design actually worked? But yet the lessons Benner learned go back decades. In 1986, Benner started a lab at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich and began to rebuild DNA's backbone. He quickly realized that what seemed like a flaw might be a feature. When he and his team replaced the backbone's negatively charged phosphates with neutral chemical groups, they found that any strand longer than about a dozen units folded up on itself, probably because repelling charges were needed to keep the molecule stretched out. Yet with all of his education and hard lessons learned about why the DNA was designed the way it was, Benner still had the gall to call DNA stupidly designed. Instead of so arrogantly and ignorantly criticizing the designer, may I suggest you ask the designer, why did you design it that way? You might be surprised at the answer you get, because I guarantee you there will be a reason for the design. And while you're at it, perhaps you should ask the designer to forgive you for criticizing his incredible handiwork out of your own sheer ignorance. Now, I'm certainly not opposed to Dr. Benner attempting to improve the DNA. In fact, I hope he continues his attempts to do so. Why? Because then he will learn himself why the DNA was designed the way it was. Perhaps Dr. Benner might even come to the realization that King David did when he said, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Some researchers are considering the possibility that we are simply a computer simulation, and that we can, and should, test this hypothesis. Now, depending on what your simulated world is like, this might remind you of The Matrix, or perhaps the computer the mice built in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So, if we don't really exist and we are nothing more than a complex computer simulation, how, pray tell, do these researchers intend to test for the computer program? Well, it's simple, really. It's right in the abstract of the paper. The simulation scenario is first motivated by extrapolating current trends and computational resource requirements for lattice QCD into the future. Using the historical development of lattice gauge theory technology as a guide, we assume that our universe is an early numerical simulation with unimproved Wilson-Fermion discretization and investigate potentially observable consequences. Translation? We're going to make this computer simulation, see? And then we'll look at the universe. And if the energies in the universe match our simulations, then we're probably in a simulation. In essence, the researchers are looking for signs of intelligence in the universe. Well, they might as well start looking in the universe, because I'm starting to question whether or not there's any intelligent life here on Earth. But notice that these researchers just subtly invoked the use of the scientific tool of intelligent design. Let's explore this scientific tool in Crevo Rant number 121, Ideas.
Well, some people posted some comments on YouTube referring to the intelligent design community as ideas. Ooh, remember the words of the sage, guys. Keep your words warm and soft. You may have to eat them. The ID people are anything but idiots. First of all, they're comprised of some of the most brilliant people on planet Earth. Secondly, all they're doing is pointing out a very simple scientific tool that even children use every day. Now in rant number 93, 94, and 107, I show you why evolution is a supernatural process by very definition of the word, because it violates all scientific observation that we can make in nature. Evolution is neither scientific nor natural. Well, we get a problem then. If evolution is a supernatural process, and creation is also a supernatural process, and both are outside of the realm of science, how then can we use science to deduce which one is the correct faith? Evolution or creation? Because they're both blind faiths. Whether evolution produced the first life or whether the creator God produced the first life, nobody was there to observe the event. Enter intelligent design, referred to as ID. So I'm walking out in the bush and I stumble upon this box. Do you think this box had a creator? Well, of course it did. Congratulations! You just used the scientific tool of intelligent design and proved my point. So we now have a scientific tool based on deductive reasoning that we can use and apply to the origins debate to figure out which faith is the correct one, evolution or creation. You see, the scientific tool of intelligent design is just that, a scientific tool. It is deductive reasoning, not blind faith. For instance, did this have a creator? What about this? Or this? Or this? You know that these objects had a creator. This is scientific deduction. This is not blind faith. You didn't see the creator make them, you have no idea who made them, but you know that an intelligent source made them. So let's take a look inside the cell. The DNA is housed in the nucleus of the cell. The DNA contains the blueprints for all of the cell and all of the mechanisms in the cell. The DNA provides the blueprints or plans for the protein synthesis factory. But the protein synthesis factory produces the proteins that are needed to make the DNA. The protein synthesis factory makes the proteins that are needed for the power plant, like mitochondria. But the power plant provides the power for the protein synthesis factory to function. The protein synthesis factory makes the proteins that are needed in the assembly of the cell wall, but the cell wall is what holds the whole cell together. This is like the chicken and the egg question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? That's a nonsensical question. It was the chicken, the rooster, and the egg. They all came around at the same time. So using the scientific tool of intelligent design, is it more scientific and logical to conclude that all these complex parts were created at the same time and formed together, seeing as how they're codependent? Or is it more scientific to say that they formed by unguided processes that were completely unrelated? Think, man, think! Now, some of course will argue to say, oh, but cars and hammers and man-made objects don't reproduce, so it doesn't apply to evolution. Really? So what? Proteins and amino acids don't reproduce either, and you need those for the origin of life. Check out rant number 107 to find out why it's absolutely impossible for proteins to have formed without outside intelligent guidance and direction. And check out rant number 78 to find out why origin of the species by natural processes is absolutely impossible. It is perfectly logical and scientific to conclude that complex life systems were formed by an intelligent designer. It is completely unscientific and illogical to suggest that complex biological systems arose separate from one another when they need one another. And intelligent design, contrary to what was said at the Kitzmiller-Dover trial in Pennsylvania, intelligent design is not creationism in disguise. It is a scientific tool that everybody uses every day. Many of these same people who refer to the intelligent design camp as idiots then turn around and use the tool of intelligent design in things like the SETI project. That's the search for extraterrestrial life. Yes, they're looking for intelligent design in space signals so that they can prove that there's life on other planets. Talk about not seeing the forest for the trees. Good grief! They delve into outer space looking for radio signals that show signs of being intelligently designed. That's the tool of intelligent design. But yet, when we point out that life is just too complex to have evolved, they say it's unscientific to conclude that it was intelligently designed. Life is just so much more infinitely complex than a silly radio signal. Do you not see the hypocrisy in this? But it's not just good enough to know that there's an intelligent designer. In rant number 15, I tell you how you can know who that creator is. I happen to know the designer of life. His name was Jesus Christ, named by name as the creator in John chapter 1, verse 3. I know him personally. How about you?
So, once again, we see researchers looking for signs of intelligence in the universe and literally not seeing the forest for the trees. They deny the glaringly obvious evidence of design in nature. Design demands a designer. They then look for signs of intelligent design elsewhere. Why? It's psychological. They are looking for a different designer than the God of the Bible. It has nothing to do with science. It has to do with a rejection of their creator. They will embrace the possibility of an alien creator as long as it's not the God of the Bible. I mean, it's understandable. God has warned us of a judgment to come, the great white throne judgment, where each and every one of us will give an account for our lives. But he also made the ultimate sacrifice because he desires to show mercy and not judgment. His own son paid the penalty for your sins and mine. But to accept this unspeakable gift requires you to give your life completely to him and live your life as if you were him. Give us 30 seconds. We'll be right back with the mailbag.
What does the Bible say about aliens? Is there life on other planets? What can science tell us about the possibility of aliens? Ian Juby gives answers to these and many more questions in this fascinating and highly disturbing subject. Looking analytically at the subject, complete with the testimonies of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. The answers will probably surprise you. In this 1.5-hour lecture, Ian shows that the alleged aliens are a problem and that Jesus is the solution. Order online today at Ian's bookstore.
Mail for me? Evidently, the anti-creationists recently gathered for the second annual Stop Ian Juby Symposium, apparently a closed-door meeting held at an undisclosed location recently. Now, I don't know where or when this was, because again, I wasn't invited. I came to this conclusion based on the barrage of emails and comments I received, which all said the same thing. Again. Apparently, after days of deliberation among themselves, the anti-creationists agreed upon a response to the overwhelming scientific evidence I've brought up, refuting evolution and affirming creation. Their top 3 responses to the overwhelming scientific evidence is: you're still fat, you still don't have a doctorate, and you're a liar. Of all the accusations of liar, only 2 actually specified what it was I was allegedly lying about. My quote from Louis Jacobs, who was commenting on the conclusions we could draw if people and dinosaurs were found living at the same time. Now, this is quite humorous in that the anti-creationists have once again shot themselves in the foot. I even provided the reference so that any viewer can go and read the quote for themselves. Now, apparently because I quoted an evolutionist, this somehow makes me a liar because I am somehow portraying Jacobs as agreeing with my position? Oh wow, your desperation is showing, guys. That was my whole point. Jacobs is an evolutionist who said exactly the same thing I did with regards to the conclusions one would draw if it turned out people and dinosaurs lived together. In fact, in the very quote, Jacobs refers to Genesis as a myth. So to turn around and suggest that I was somehow portraying Jacobs as affirming creation is nothing less than a desperate dishonesty. I mean, even if my evolutionary viewers see through your thinly veiled and desperate attempts to distract from the evidence. You're frantically flailing away with ridiculous accusations, all the while trying desperately not to look at the evidence that I'm showing. All the while, I can't help but notice that these anti-creationists faithfully watch my show every week in order to send me detailed emails of why they hate my show so much. I can only say thank you for your viewership and support. Shannon wrote in on Facebook, "Hey Ian, did you ever cover where the people went from the flood in another rant maybe, or which of your complete creation videos? Why do we find dinosaur bones and not as many human bones mixed in with them? I believe I know the answer, but I'm curious of your take on it. Great video as usual from our favorite creationist, and by the way, Grayson was laughing so hard at the what happened to the dinosaurs theories. Too funny." Hi Shannon, as I mentioned on previous shows, at least one paleontologist, Chris Stringer from the British Museum of Natural History, has stated there are tens of thousands of human fossils that he knew of that nobody seems to be talking about. Why? Well, that's a very good question. I would like to know the answer to that question too. Where were these fossils found? What strata were they found in? Were there any found in layers dated to the time of the dinosaurs? Who found these fossils? Until these questions are answered, all we can say is that there's a whole mess of questions and no answers. Basically what I'm getting at here is that there has been many human bones found, but the evolutionary researchers do not talk about them. Now, however, there is the Ashley phosphate beds of the eastern U.S. seaboard, which contain a myriad of fossils from mammoths, dinosaurs like the hadrosaurs, as well as fossil humans, all in the same layer. The late geologist John Watson had written about these beds in his book, Man, Dinosaurs, and Mammals Together, which I highly recommend. It's a small book, easy reading, and a measly $8 from Mount Blanco. You can order it online here. Okay, we have to call that a show for this week. I'm your host, Ian Juby, signing off for now and thanking you for watching. Please join us again next Genesis week, assuming we survive the Mayan end of the world. Remember, you can send in your questions, comments, criticisms, and hate mail to us in a number of ways. Email us, send us a tweet, or leave a comment on the last show on our YouTube channel at genesisweek.com. Let us remember those words of comfort and warning from our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me." We'll see you next week.
We need your support to help keep this program on the air. You can help by making a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, K2K 2P4. You can also sign up for Ian's newsletter, detailing current research and news items at ianjuby.org.